In the year 2225, the United States was no longer the united, bustling nation it once was. The world had fractured into territories governed by different factions, where survival depended on cunning and brutality. Among the ruins of what had once been New York City, Elliot Harper lived a life no one could envy. Born into an unforgiving world, he had learned early that trust was a luxury few could afford, and love was something only the rich could afford to lose. The death of his parents, when he was barely 5, left him an orphan, a small child abandoned to the streets with nothing but the haunting echoes of their last words and the cold bite of poverty. His mother, a woman with a lineage from distant stars, had once been exiled for her connection to the royal family. His father, a soldier in the rebellion against the regime, had died protecting a secret that would haunt Elliot throughout his life. No one had ever told him the full story, but he had grown up knowing that both their deaths were no accident. They had been silenced, crushed by the very empire they had fought to overthrow. From that day forward, Elliot had lived on the streets, barely scraping by. He stole, lied, and fought for every scrap of food, each breath a reminder that the world had no place for someone like him. He didn't care much about the future. There was only today, only the bitter reality of surviving each day. But even in the darkest corners of the world, fate had a way of finding you. The day the officer came to claim him, Elliot had just turned 18. He had been hunched in the shadows of an old, dilapidated building, hoping to avoid yet another gang war that raged through the Undercity, when the officer's voice had sliced through the chaos like a blade. "You are Elliot Harper," the officer said, his words devoid of warmth. Elliot had barely looked up, thinking it was just another thug looking for trouble. He was wrong. The man, tall and severe, approached him with a sense of authority that spoke of power. "You are being summoned," the officer continued, "by the Astral Empire." Elliot's stomach churned. The Astral Empire, he had heard whispers of it. A kingdom of stars, where royalty ruled over planets, controlling not just Earth but an entire galaxy. For someone like Elliot, this might as well have been the stuff of legends, something that happened to other people, not to a boy like him. "You're mistaken," Elliot replied, his voice hoarse from the grime of the streets. "I don't belong to any empire." But the officer's cold gaze never wavered. "You are the last descendant of the royal bloodline. Your fate is not yours to decide." With that, Elliot's world turned upside down. He was dragged from the Undercity, thrust into a reality he couldn't understand. There were no explanations, only orders. He was told to clean up, put on fine clothes, and then he was taken aboard a ship unlike anything he had ever seen. The stars beyond the windows of the ship blurred into streaks of light, and the vastness of space swallowed him whole. The feeling was as overwhelming as it was suffocating. It wasn't until he arrived at the Astral Palace on Niven 4 that he learned the full extent of what was happening. The palace stood like a fortress against the cosmos, its sheer size and opulence terrifying in its splendor. For Elliot, a boy who had spent his entire life in the crumbling streets, it felt like an alien world. People with smiles too perfect to be real spoke to him with respect, though it felt more like pity than admiration. There was a sense of detachment in the way they treated him, like a thing, a commodity. But no one would ever explain why he was here, or why he was being forced into a marriage contract with Princess Thalia, the future ruler of the Astral Empire. It was all too much to comprehend until he stood face to face with her, Princess Thalia. She was as beautiful as she was cold, her royal presence emanating from every inch of her. Her eyes, a piercing shade of violet, studied him with an unsettling calm, as though she were assessing a stranger, a mere pawn in a game too grand to understand. The first time their gazes locked, Elliot saw only indifference in her eyes. She did not see a man, nor a potential partner. She saw a tool, a vessel for political leverage, nothing more. "You are here to marry me," she said flatly, her tone void of emotion. "Your bloodline entitles you to the throne, but your role is not to question. Your life is not your own anymore." For a moment, Elliot felt the weight of her words settle deep within him. He wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to escape this cold, suffocating reality, but he knew better. He was trapped in a contract he had no say in, his life a bargain made before he even had the chance to understand its cost. The days that followed were a blur of forced lessons in royal etiquette and history. Elliot was expected to become someone he wasn't, to embrace a life that seemed impossible, even repulsive. But the more he learned about his parents' past, the more he realized that this was not merely an arranged marriage. It was a political maneuver designed to strengthen the Empire's hold over both Earth and the distant planets. Yet, even amidst his anger and resentment, something began to shift in Elliot. He found himself watching Thalia, not with contempt, but with curiosity. She was a prisoner in this world, just as much as he was. She had been raised with the same expectations, her life a carefully constructed illusion. Despite the walls she built around herself, Elliot saw glimpses of the woman beneath the crown, a woman trapped in a life she never chose, struggling to make sense of a world where emotions were mere tools to be manipulated. It was late one night, after a tense dinner with the royal family, when Elliot found himself alone with Thalia in one of the palace gardens. The moonlight illuminated her face, and for a brief moment he saw her not as a princess, but as a person, someone who understood the weight of her own burdens. "I never wanted this," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence. "But I have no choice. The Empire needs me." Elliot had no words to offer, only the raw understanding that passed between them, a silent recognition of the pain they both carried. It was a moment that lingered in his mind long after she left, a thread of connection in a sea of coldness. The next morning, as he prepared for the official announcement of their engagement, Elliot stood before the mirror, his reflection a stranger. The boy who had lived on the streets, who had only known loss and survival, was now to be a part of something greater, something he had no desire to be a part of. But in that moment, as he stared at his own reflection, he realized something deep within him. He had a choice. He could surrender to this fate, let himself be molded into the man they wanted him to be, or he could fight. He could fight for his life, for his freedom. As the wedding ceremony loomed closer, Elliot felt the weight of his decision pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what his future held, but he knew one thing: he wouldn't let his parents' legacy die in vain. No matter the cost, he would fight for something more, for a life that was his own. The countdown had begun. And in the silence of the night, as he stared at the stars through his window, Elliot Harper made a vow to never be anyone's pawn again. In the days that followed his arrival at the Astral Palace, Elliot was no longer the boy from the streets. The opulent halls and sparkling corridors had a way of hollowing out a man's soul, and despite the wealth that surrounded him, Elliot felt more like a prisoner than ever before. The palace, with its breathtaking beauty, was a gilded cage, and he was trapped inside it, held captive by a contract he had never chosen. Every lesson, every word of royal protocol felt like a mockery. The wealth, the power, none of it mattered when it felt like his life was no longer his own. Day after day, Elliot attended meetings, ate in silence at lavish banquets, and learned the ways of a world that was as foreign to him as the stars above. He had been thrust into a role of unimaginable responsibility, and with every passing moment, it became clearer he was a puppet in a game he didn't understand. His interactions with Princess Thalia, the woman he was expected to marry, were distant and strained. She seemed as trapped as he was, bound by the same chains of duty and politics, and yet there was something about her that unsettled him. At times, when their eyes met across the room, he could see the flicker of something deeper, something raw. It was as though the mask of royalty she wore was slipping, revealing a vulnerability he hadn't expected. Thalia, in all her regal beauty and composure, was not the cold, indifferent figure he had assumed. She had her own battles, her own scars hidden beneath the surface. And Elliot, for all his bitterness and anger, found himself wondering if perhaps they weren't so different after all. It was during one of these moments, when the weight of their silent understanding seemed to hang in the air, that an unexpected shift occurred. A quiet evening at the palace, a time when most of the court had gone to their chambers, left the two of them alone. The gardens of the palace, bathed in the soft glow of artificial moonlight, were eerily silent. Elliot found himself walking through the carefully manicured paths, lost in thoughts too heavy to bear. The tranquility of the night was shattered by the sound of soft footsteps approaching. Elliot, Thalia's voice, fragile and hesitant, broke the silence. He turned, his heart skipping a beat at the unexpected softness in her tone. "You're not supposed to be here," he replied, his voice a little too sharp, though he hadn't meant for it to sound that way. "Neither are you," she said, her lips curling slightly into a bitter smile. "None of us belong here. Not really." There it was again, the rawness, the truth that she was just as lost as he was. It made him pause, and for the first time, He saw her not as the princess who had to uphold the empire, but as a person. Someone who, despite all her grace and beauty, was burdened by her own fears and doubts. "I thought you wanted this," Elliot said, unable to keep the cynicism out of his voice. The power, the throne. Thalia's eyes flickered with an emotion he hadn't expected: regret. She took a step closer, her movement slow and deliberate, as though every step took an immense amount of effort. "What's power without freedom?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. The question hung in the air, and for a long moment Elliot couldn't find the words. What was power, indeed? What was any of it if it came at the cost of everything that truly mattered? He realized with a sickening clarity that he had no answers, not for her and not for himself. Thalia's hand reached out, almost imperceptibly, and for the briefest of moments their fingers brushed. It was a fleeting touch, but it spoke volumes. They were both prisoners in this world. Her eyes searched his face, looking for some kind of response, but Elliot only shook his head. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking, "but there's nothing we can do. There's nothing left to hope for." The words hit him like a blow to the chest. The hopelessness in her tone was something he understood all too well, and yet it made him angry. How could anyone accept that there was nothing left to fight for? "You're wrong," Elliot finally said, his voice steady despite the storm brewing in his chest. "There's always something worth fighting for." He turned away, not wanting her to see the raw emotion in his eyes. The next few days passed in a blur of hollow meetings and empty words. The wedding ceremony was drawing closer, and with it, the finality of his fate. Elliot had come to accept that he was nothing more than a tool to be used, a means to an end. But then, a few days before the ceremony, something unexpected happened. Elliot's past, the truth about his parents, the rebellion they had fought in, all of it came rushing back in a wave of revelations. He had been approached by a mysterious figure, a former ally of his parents, someone who had known the truth of what happened. The man revealed the dark secrets of the royal family, the truth of the betrayal that had led to the deaths of his parents. Elliot's blood boiled as he learned that everything he had believed about his parents' deaths had been a lie. They had been murdered by the very empire that now controlled his every move. The shock of the revelation left him reeling, but it also ignited something within him, something fierce, something unstoppable. If he had been living a lie all this time, then what was to stop him from taking control of his own fate? His first instinct was to run, to escape this palace of lies and manipulation. But he knew that wasn't an option. He couldn't leave without doing something about the empire that had taken everything from him, and so a new plan began to form. He would expose the truth, he would fight back, and he would take back what had been stolen from him. But before he could act, the wedding ceremony arrived, and with it, the pressure from all sides. The court was in full preparation mode, and every glance, every word exchanged between him and Thalia felt heavier than the last. He was running out of time. The wedding was not just a union of two people, it was the final step in a political game that would bind him to a future he had no say in. The truth was that he was just a pawn in a far larger game, and everyone in the palace knew it. Everyone except Thalia. She approached him that evening, her face pale under the weight of the ceremony that loomed ahead. Her eyes, though still guarded, seemed to hold a flicker of something and understanding. She said nothing, but the silent exchange between them was more meaningful than words could ever be. There was no longer any question between them. They both knew the stakes. For the first time since he had arrived, Elliot felt a glimmer of something close to hope. Not because of the throne, not because of the empire, but because in that moment he realized that he and Thalia might be able to change something after all. But even as that thought crossed his mind, he knew it wouldn't be easy. It never was. And the road ahead would be full of dangers and heartache. But for the first time in his life, Elliot was ready to face it, ready to fight for the future that was his and his alone. The days leading up to the wedding were an unrelenting blur for Elliot. With every passing moment, the weight of his fate grew heavier, and his resolve hardened like steel in the face of an inescapable future. He had spent the past weeks caught in the web of palace politics, the vast empire a machine of power and cruelty, where every movement felt preordained. And yet, somewhere deep inside him, something was shifting. A quiet fury was beginning to rise, filling him with the strength to confront the forces that sought to control him. Thalia, too, seemed to change in subtle ways as the days passed. The cold indifference that had once defined her was slowly replaced with moments of quiet reflection, as though she, too, was coming to terms with the inevitable consequences of their forced union. Her once sharp gaze had softened, and at times Elliot caught glimpses of vulnerability beneath her royal demeanor, moments when her composure faltered, when she looked at him as if searching for something they both feared to name. In the silence of those moments, they found a strange kind of understanding, an unspoken bond forged in the fires of their shared captivity, but it was not enough. Not nearly enough. The palace, a place that had once felt like a gilded cage, was now a battleground, a place where every smile concealed a knife, every conversation a trap. Elliot had long since realized that the empire's heart was rotten, its rulers driven by nothing but ambition and self-preservation. But it was not just the royalty that held power. It was the hidden factions that lurked in the shadows, the unseen hands that pulled the strings. It was these forces that Elliot now had to face. A figure appeared in the palace one evening, a shadow among the courtiers. He was an old man, once an advisor to his father, someone who had known the truths of Elliot's lineage long before the Empire had silenced his family. The man, whose name was Alaron, had arrived under the pretense of an ordinary advisor, but there was nothing ordinary about him. His presence was a warning. Alaron spoke to Elliot in hushed tones, in secret corners, revealing to him the truth of his parents' death, the true cause of their betrayal. They had not died by accident. They had been murdered, sacrificed by the very people who had once promised them safety. The Empire had feared their knowledge, their power, and had chosen to destroy them. The realization was like a slap to Elliot's face, a cold, brutal truth that shattered everything he thought he knew about his past. His anger was a roaring flame, one that threatened to consume him, but there was no time to indulge in it. The Empire was not finished with him yet. As the wedding drew nearer, the final pieces of his plan began to fall into place. It was a dangerous game he was playing, a game of deception, manipulation, and trust. But Elliot knew there was no other choice. If he was to survive, if he was to honor the memory of his parents, he had to fight, and he would fight not just for himself, but for Thalia as well. She, too, was trapped in a system that demanded her obedience, that chained her to a throne she had never wanted. They both had something to prove, and they would do it together, but as the night before the wedding arrived, an unexpected twist left Elliot reeling. A message arrived in the dead of night, a secret message from the very heart of the royal family, from a trusted ally of Thalia's mother. The note spoke of a plot to eliminate Elliot before the wedding, a plan to rid the Empire of the last threat to the throne. The conspirators knew that Elliot's presence was the only thing standing between them and absolute control. The assassination was already in motion. Thalia, upon learning of the plot, did something that both shocked and terrified Elliot. She came to him in the quiet darkness of their chambers, her face pale with fear but determined. She had seen the truth, and she knew that there was no other way. Her hand shook as she handed him a dagger, a weapon of betrayal that had once belonged to her father. "It is the only way," she whispered, her voice breaking under the weight of the decision. "I cannot let them take you. I cannot let them destroy everything you fought for." The choice was cruel, and yet in that moment it was the only one they had. Elliot's heart thundered in his chest as he met her gaze. The look in her eyes was not that of a royal princess, but of a woman who had finally found the courage to fight for her own freedom, her own destiny. It was a dangerous decision, a betrayal of the very family that had raised her, but it was the only path forward. In the hours that followed, they moved quickly, silently, their hearts pounding in their chests as they executed the plan. The palace, once a place of lavish grandeur, now felt like a labyrinth of shadows and danger. Every step they took was a step closer to the edge of a cliff, and Elliot could feel the tension between them growing, the weight of the choices they were about to make. But as they approached the heart of the conspiracy, something changed in Elliot. The years of anger, the bitterness, the hatred, it all melted away. What remained was a resolve stronger than anything he had ever felt. This was not just about survival anymore. This was about vengeance, justice, and redemption. As they reached the inner chambers of the conspirators, they were confronted by a figure neither of them had expected. Prince Aldrich, the man who had once been a rival, a thorn in their side, now stood before them, his smile twisted with malice. He had known all along, it seemed, about the plot, and had chosen to let it unfold. His eyes glittered with the promise of power. You really thought you could change things? Aldrich sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. You are nothing. You will always be nothing. But in that moment, Elliot felt something stir within him. It wasn't just anger or rage, it was a sense of clarity, a sense of purpose. He had no intention of being anyone's pawn anymore. He was not the orphan boy who had once cowered in the shadows. He was a man, a king in waiting, and he would no longer let the Empire dictate his fate. The confrontation was swift, brutal, and bloody. In the chaos that followed, Aldrich's forces were defeated, his grip on the palace shattered. And though Elliot stood victorious, he could not shake the feeling that he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The Empire had been forever altered by their actions, and the consequences of their decisions would echo through the corridors of power for years to come. As the dust settled, and the throne that had once seemed so distant was now within reach, Elliot turned to Thalia, the woman who had become so much more than a mere political ally. The bond between them had deepened, forged in the fires of their shared struggle. But there was still a heaviness in the air, a weight that neither of them could shake. They had won the battle, but the war was far from over. The Empire was a vast, unyielding machine, and it would not bow easily to the whims of a prince and his reluctant bride. But as they stood together on the precipice of a new dawn, Elliot knew one thing with absolute certainty. They were no longer pawns in this game. They were players, and the world would soon learn what happened when two unwilling souls found the courage to change their fate.